Hi guys. We'll probably expect a few more people to join in the first in the next 2 minutes, but I suggest we get started, and then I've got a very short introduction anyway, so hopefully by then we'll have everyone. Well, welcome to the 28 of you today. Thank you for joining us. So today we're going to talk about performance metrics in this session and agency management. As you know, as the saying goes, if you don't measure it, you cannot improve it. And this is why we think, one of the most valuable tools an advertiser has to elevate the relationship and performance with agencies or marketing partners is a formal evaluation program. But a poorly executed evaluation process can be more detrimental than good and have an impact on the overall client agency relationship if it's really bad. It's also great to hold our agency partners accountable for the quality and performance of the work that they deliver on our account. So client and agencies work towards a common goal, which would be growth. And this is why we've seen more and more performance-based remuneration models being put in place. However, here again, it's really critical to ensure that the KPIs in place are fair to agencies, truly impactable by the agency, not subjective, or with a clear attribution to the agency performance. So I'm delighted to moderate this panel, as I think a well-managed agency is definitely a competitive advantage for brands right now. I'm Laura Forcetti. I work for the WFA, so World Federation of Advertisers. And today I'm with two great WFA members, Claire and Juan Pablo. Maybe you just want to introduce yourself. Maybe it's probably easier. Juan Pablo, I see you're not on mute, so do you want to be the first?
Yeah, for sure. I'll go ahead. So good morning, good afternoon, and good night, everybody. I don't know where you're joining from. So my name is Juan Pablo Alvarez. I am the Global Procurement Director for Marketing Services at AbInBev. And just a little bit about myself. So I have spent my whole career, more than 12 years, working on procurement, always on the indirect side, managing every possible category. The last 6 years of that career within AbInBev, bouncing around on different roles as well within procurement, but super passionate about this, about the marketing world, right? And especially recognizing that one of the most critical parts in that marketing chain are our agency partners, right? So making sure that we understand how to work together and having the right process, for me, it's critical, not only for the organization as a whole or for the marketing team, but as procurement, because we have a very big role to play to make sure that that relationship gives out the best creative output possible, which is the intent. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm pretty sure that within these 45 minutes, we'll get to know more about each other.
Cool, thank you. So I'm Claire Thibault. I'm British, not French. I know my name's confusing. I have 18 years in marketing procurement. So started off in the UK, and the last 10 years have been in France. I've worked across various industries, having local, regional and global roles. The last 4 years I've been in the beauty industry, so Coty, and most recently joined Estée Lauder.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you to both of you for joining and sharing your insights on the topic of agency management and performance metrics. And welcome to, so we doubled in size, so we've got 42 participants now. So, right, so I've got a few questions for you guys. But so to all of you in the audience as well, if you've got some more questions that you'd like me to put to the panel, please feel free to add them in the chat or the Q&A box. And I'll try to incorporate some of them in the discussion, but I can also, we can also dedicate some time at the end to get through them as well. So, right. So my very first question may sound easy, but I think it's really about the why. Talking about, client agency performance evaluations. Why do we do that? And how does it generally work in your respective companies? I don't know if one of you would maybe like to start, and then the second one would maybe complete and share what would be different from your in your organization. Claire, maybe should I
Sure.
Yeah, go on.
Okay.
Throw me in. So
You want to go, Claire?
yeah, thank you. So yes, no, I think it's really important to have agency reviews. It's as much as you would do for your own people. You continuously talk to them, you want them to grow. You also want your agencies to grow, and you never want to get to a point where, and although it still happens, somebody decides they don't want to work with them anymore and it's all gone wrong for months and months and you didn't know anything about it. So I think there's a real role for procurement to help with the business in terms of how we work with our agencies, how we communicate with them, and getting them to continuously understand the different areas of where the growth is, where we need to improve, but equally, if possible, for the clients are asked to actually listen and grow as well, because it could be coming from our side. So really try and keep that dialogue, getting the right people in the room. And I see procurement as the sort of mediator in that process to really get the parties together to discuss and do a bit of a stop, start and continue or something on how to move forward. In a nutshell.
Thank you.
So I would say, yeah, I would say, Claire, 100% agree with you, right? That it's super important. I wouldn't say that otherwise. I think the main purpose is, and Laura, you touched on it, right? If we cannot measure it, we cannot improve it. But more than that, I think having the right process for evaluation forces us to do something that needs to happen even before that, right? Which is making sure that we align with our agencies and very clear what is the goal that together we're trying to achieve and what is the expectation of both parties, right? If we know that in advance, that we can start measuring then the impact of the work that's coming out of the agency. And then that's going to give us what Claire mentioned, which is actually that tangible, objective information to have meaningful conversations about whether this is working or not. What are we doing wrong from both sides? Because this is not something that, again, it's only one-sided, and will allow us to make better decisions. Do we want to work with X agency? Yes or no? Do we think we're investing the right amount of money? Yes or no? Are they delivering what we expect or over-delivering? Yes or no, right? So all that data and everything that we can get out of those conversations and that evaluation process is something that we need to make sure that we improve. Otherwise, it's just subjective. It's just relationships that live in the short term instead of living on the long term, and they live between people and not brand and agency, which should transcend the relationship, which is super important, don't get me wrong, between the brand teams and the agency teams. So that's what I would say on the first part. And then you also mentioned, how do we do it? So last year, for example, on AbInBev, we launched a very big project to make sure that we understood everything that needs to be addressed to improve the creative outcome coming out of our agencies, right? And we ended up with a very nice process that we're on the journey of implementing, which is our evaluation process that touches on, again, going from making sure that our brand teams give like a very clear briefing process, that we understand as well what are the specific deliverables that they're asking, what are the KPIs that we're going to measure them and the expectations, and then on a quarterly basis, making sure that we have all that data to sit down on a kind of 360 review way to make sure that the agency has a voice as well, and we address all those issues so we can get to the end of the year and be able to really assess what was the performance of the agency without any of the barriers that we usually see, right? Which I don't want to call them excuses, but they're barriers because they're just, let's call them waste areas around the process and the relationship that tend to affect the outcome of the relationship. So that's usually how we're doing it, and that's a journey that we're on right now.
Thank you. I see we have two questions. I'm not going to ignore them, but there's one that I'm planning to ask to the panelists anyways in two questions, and then there is another one. I guess we'll keep it for the end. But thank you so much to you both for this introduction. And Claire, I just have just one question, because we're talking about in general about client performance evaluation models, but do you think it should be the same across the globe and for all agencies, or should you have some regional differences that need to be taken into account? And if yes, do you have any examples that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, to be honest, I've tended to do the same thing for all with my global or regional roles, or even local. I tend to keep the same kind of structure, and I don't really change it too much. Obviously, I'm open if there's a better way of doing it, but I tend to keep it quite simple, because if it's too lengthy, too many questions, it's just painful to do. Then you have to analyze it. I think sometimes we can get into, or these questionnaires feel like questionnaires for the sake of it, and then it just gives you a score and you don't really do anything. What I try to do is keep the same structure. So I generally have 5 sets of things. So probably relationship, operational elements, a section on the thing that you're actually buying, so creative or whatever, maybe a bit more complex for media, but and then the cost elements, etc. And then maximum 5 questions for each section. You weight it, you score it, and try and get the people to score it that are actually working on it, as well as the senior management. But I really keep it the same for most types of agency, unless it's particularly complex. And that way, from a leader of marketing procurement, you've got the same format and you can easily, understand, pick it up quite easily. And for the CMO as well, they're looking at the same sets of look and feel in terms of how the agencies are measured, and it just helps facilitate things. And then you can concentrate more on, if you do a 360, ideally, where are the disconnects between what you think is happening and what the agency think is happening? What do they think of you as a client? And you look at those outliers and really zoom in and do that session. When we was able to be in the room, I would have them in the room and sort of get them to talk to each other, pull it out, look at the verbatim, and then do the stop, start and continue, and then manage that process after. But generally speaking, no, I don't have it different for regional or different agency sets. The format for me remains the same. Maybe some question set will differ slightly.
And I agree with you. I think you need some degree of harmonization, excuse my French, harmonization to be able to also, from a global perspective, to sort of compare and see where the gaps are and really learn from the entire evaluation process. So thank you. I've got my next question is a question that we had in mind already, and then was also in the chat, in the Q&A box. So it's about the effect of the pandemic on your performance evaluation process. Juan, Pablo, maybe has the pandemic had an effect on your performance evaluation process? And if yes, why and how? And I'm going to make it just a bit more complicated, because the question from the chat was about media performance. So maybe did it change? Did it have an impact? And then maybe if you have some examples about media performance.
Yeah, for sure. Would you believe me if I said no, it didn't have a change? So I think, to be honest, I mean, COVID and this pandemic changed everything, right? And one of the things that made us realize is that we can have the most structured process in place, but then again, it's not fault proof and it doesn't adapt for every changing situation, right? So I think not to be vague on my answer, it did have an effect, and on a couple of things, right? First of all, is in the way that we had built our SOWs, especially with the agencies that we kind of plan and forecast the entire year with, right? Because at the beginning, our marketing teams made a certain plan considering the different campaigns and ideas and platforms that they were gonna execute for that year, right? And suddenly pandemic hits, and then guess what? We go from saying we're gonna big bet on live events, and suddenly there's nobody in the streets, right? So we need to make sure that maybe we engage agencies to do, I don't know, creative thinking on how to approach Olympics, right? And then that gets killed. So there's multiple things that we needed to go back, that we had to go back and kind of changed, not from an evaluation perspective or from a scope perspective, just to be able then that we could translate that new ask for our agencies into new metrics and new KPIs, right? It also changed the way that we invest money, right? I think everybody was put on the spot in the sense of what they could invest in their brands or not. And this is where we also had a healthy conversation with our agency partners to say that this is what needs to happen, right? And more kind of in line on the specific KPIs. If you think about KPIs around delivery of the campaigns, right? Or when our campaigns would go to where that would have an impact on, I don't know, brand power, on attention, on brand lift, then this gets delayed. COVID makes things delayed. Therefore, the agency will not be able to meet those obligations in time. And then it's not fair, and I don't like that word, but it's not fair to hold them accountable to something that the situation precludes them to deliver, right? So it did have an impact, and it required a lot of, let's call them good faith conversations to go back to the table and reassess what is it that we're after and what do we need to do? What are KPIs that could actually be measured considering the circumstances? And then try to put that again into a scope of work that wouldn't change that much again, because this happened in March, May, and then again, we didn't have the visibility of how long it was going to last or what would happen throughout the year. So it did have a big effect. I think this is where we realize that our process needs to be flexible. And there are some KPIs that we need to realize throughout the journey. And this is where I'm going to reinforce the importance of that constant communication to realize that they're not the right KPIs to have in that year, and that we can come up with new ones instead of waiting throughout the year. And then what happens? December comes and they say, hey, but COVID hit. And then we say, you know what? Yeah, but we didn't talk about that. And then everything becomes complicated to really assess, especially if there's a lot of the compensation a lot of the performance linked to variable compensation. So big effect on how we measure it. But then again, everything changed because of COVID. So this is just one more side that we need to react on.
Thank you. And we're gonna, in a few questions, we're gonna move to the remuneration, the link with remuneration, compensation of agencies. And I fully agree again with you, Juan Pablo. You need to ensure that the KPIs that you're using are truly impactable by the agencies. So if they're linked to sales, or I mean, it's so volatile at the moment, you know, it may be good if you're in a good position in your industry, but it may be really not good. And then your agency is still delivering really good work. So it makes sense to adapt and make sure that it's still a good way, motivating for them to be assessed on these ones. Thank you. Mohammed, I hope this was a good answer for you. We didn't really talk. Do you want to give some examples of media, the impact of media, and like changes, Juan Pablo, on the media KPIs? Or
I would say pretty much it changed for the same, right? So when we set out the year and we try to think about reach and frequency of the different campaigns that we want to have out there, this kind of changes everything, right? And it forces us as well to reassess along with our media partners to understand what are the different channels that we need to prioritize based now on the new situation of the world and so on. So it did have an effect. Again, KPIs changed, but like I said, I think I go back to saying that's a good faith and partnership conversation that needs to happen when these kind of situations pop up, and the realization from both parties that the same KPIs that we decided at the beginning of the year might not be the same ones.
Thank you. Thank you. I've heard of one of our members who's tried to integrate what they call a helpfulness index score. So how helpful were your agencies during the pandemic? You know, and it's quite interesting. This is probably not something you would have thought before, but that's one of the new KPIs that they integrated. Right. Yeah. So my next question, and it's based on my view, is that, you know, agencies evaluation should help agencies deliver better outcomes, but also as well as support clients becoming better clients that agencies are motivated to work for. And this was one of the questions that we got as well from Susanna in the chat. So how do you keep your agencies motivated to work for your respective organizations and create that sentiment of being your agency's client of choice. And Susanna's question was, how has the 360 feedback from your agency change how you partner with your agency? So how did you integrate the feedback that you got from agencies to become better clients, basically? Maybe Claire, do you want to go for it?
Yeah. So I think the 360, first on the 360 part, and then I'll answer the other question. So on the 360, I think it works really well, because even if the outcome is not so good, and you found that there's this disconnect and things aren't working or whatever, the agency really feels like they are being given the opportunity to work through whatever the issue is. Sometimes they're not as aware as you think they are of the issue. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they have reasoning and you might be able to do something that's going to make the thing work better, or you know, you just go through those motions, and sometimes even if the result is you decide that the fit isn't there, or maybe they get penalized a bit in their remuneration, but they feel like the process is fair, and it's not just, I've scored you 15, your bonus is, I don't know, 5%, and that's it, end of conversation. I think, you know, having that proper quality time, conversation, a moment outside of the everyday to talk through everything and then follow up, ideally, and that procurement's role was in there to help make that happen. It really does make the difference. And I've been in those situations where it's not been a good review, but we've worked out how we're going to fix it, and they felt like they had the opportunity to do that, and they weren't just sort of told off. Otherwise, that's a very transactional way to work. If you want a partner, you're going to have that open discussion. What was the first part of the question that you asked? Oh, how to motivate them.
Yeah, how to get them motivated to work for your account.
Yes. So I think there's a number of things. One of them is around that sort of review and the way in which you treat them with respect as a partner, and that you're constantly talking to them and you've got a good relationship with them. I think if you're down the transactional route, then they probably aren't interested so much. I think even if they love to solve problems and they want to come up with something creative and they want to test their brains. So if they are involved at the front end, like procurement people, don't we hate it when we get given a scope and they've already decided the suppliers and it's already, can you just pitch this? How boring. And you're thinking, I have more to give. Well, so does the agency. So maybe, you know, trying to get them involved when, if they're a partner, when you're ideating something or you've got a problem with something, then they might come up with a solution rather than us being prescriptive to them. That will motivate them. Challenging them instead of pitching all the time. Why don't they do an internal pitch against, you know, their creative teams? You know, that could be quite fun for them to come up with some ideas in the, I don't know, whatever world it is that you're buying within marketing procurement, because then they're not feeling threatened. It's moving that threat away. We tend to be more open as human beings when we don't think we're going to be threatened and the thing might be taken away from us. So I think, you know, really, I try to go down the human element of dealing with people and being open and trying to find that way, I think is a good one. The other one is, you know, recognition, getting them in front of your senior management, enabling them to showcase. You can't always allow them to use your brand. I've worked at places where it was a no, but they were absolutely motivated to work for the brand, even if they couldn't shout about it. Internally, it was a big thing on the agency side. I think those are the big ones. My biggest one is respect and being human and not transactional. So yeah. Which
will also help changing the face of marketing procurement as a whole if you act
yeah, but you kind of, you know, it needs to be within the whole marketing procurement team. We can't be sending one-liners and things like that to our agencies. Maybe ring them or now text them. I keep texting everybody and stuff at the moment. So, you know, treat them as an extension to your team and you know, you can still keep the confidentiality and stuff. You don't have to tell them everything, but we need to move away from being quite so guarded, because it's stifling the creativity and the innovation.
Thank you. Juan, Pablo, what are your how do you keep your agencies motivated to work for your for AbInBev and create that sentiment of being the agency's client of choice?
So I'm going to echo part of Claire's message, right? And there's the respect and the communication. And one of the key factors is giving them the freedom to, let's call it, take risks, right? If we're dealing with agencies in which we always tell them what they need to do, how they need to test, what is the direction that we want, and so on, imagine the creative team working for that is they're not challenged or excited about the brand. It's just they're following a path, right? So when we engage on this project that I told you last year, when we engage our major partners and we had an honest conversation of what was working and what was not, that was let's say the biggest takeaway that we got from all of them, where they say we like when we have space to create and to take challenges and to propose new things, right? That keeps us closer to the brand, and it's not just another business that we want to work on or that we need to work on for a certain period of time. Is we become attached to the brand and we're constantly thinking what to do with it, and then you gain a partner, right? I'm also going to touch on something that you said as a closure for the question that I think Mohammed changed, right? That the KPIs need to be attributable or manageable by the agency. But the way that we see this as well is that we need to understand that variable compensation on KPIs that are going to be 100%, let's say the agency is going to be 100% accountable to deliver them, are only going to get to a certain extent. But then one of the things that we can offer the agencies is, if we think about the way that we can split the KPIs, and again, the way that we do it is we have three big buckets, right? One big bucket is about, let's call it customer satisfaction, right? Which is the health of the relationship. We do NPS, for example, a couple of questions that Claire does and so on. The other one are KPIs more linked to brand performance, right? And I touched a little bit on this, brand power, brand lift, engagement, whatever. But then there's another set of KPIs that are in our interest for the agency to help us deliver, and they should be in the interest of the agency that we get there, which is net revenue, which is increase in volume, right? And a lot of times when we engage the agencies and we try to propose that KPI to define variable compensation, their main argument is, I don't control that, right? I can have an amazing creative work, we can have an amazing campaign that tests perfectly, that we get engagement and so on, but guess what? Macro conditions come into play and then we don't get an uplift in volume, right? But then again, if we use that to put the cherry on top of the cake for them and saying, this is your compensation, this is a fixed part, this is your variable part, and this is what you're gonna get. But because I want you hand in hand with me on the trenches, if we over deliver on those kind of macro KPIs, let's call it that, then you should also be getting some of that reward, let's call it that. So that's another way to keep them incentivized. And the other thing that we have done as well is, because we realize that the advertising agency is changing a lot, we're putting something that we call, let's say, one-line briefs, right? Which is certain ideas that it doesn't merit being a full campaign or a full scope of work at the beginning of the year, because there are concepts that we have in our head, but that we share them with our main agencies and we say, this is something that we're thinking about. If you are to build on something and create something that we really like, then we're going to invest behind it, right? So that also keeps them excited and willing to develop new ideas, because they know that if something pops up, we will be willing to invest money behind their idea. So this is a way that we kind of help them as well keep incentivized, but the true or the most meaningful one, as Claire says, is them feeling part of the team. If they feel like this is a business and they just have to work on something, whatever you get in terms of money and everything else will not make a difference. If they feel like they're part of the team, there are years where the compensation might be amazing, years where, okay, we're gonna have to tighten up our belt, but if you have a true partner, you will take the ride with them.
Thank you. And you're both sort of on the same page, saying that agencies should be seen as sort of extended arms of marketing teams. Even if it's not part of the same company officially, you're sort of working towards the same goal, and they should be seen as team members somehow, not just mere suppliers. Thank you. So the next questions that we had planned were about remuneration. I just would like to integrate just 2 questions from the many we got in the Q&A. There was one question was one of the attendees was asking for concrete examples of KPIs that you use. Would you maybe, obviously you're not going to be probably like able to provide an exhaustive list of them, but maybe like 2 or 3 which you think are very useful, very quickly, maybe Claire, like three examples of metrics that you're using, performance metrics.
I try, yeah. I more look at, what's the balance between qualitative and quantitative. So in terms of qualitative, then obviously that's your subjective ones, and whatever they are, that they know what they are at the beginning would be good. And they're happy with how you're actually going to measure them, so you don't get into an argument at the end. In terms of quantitative, I think it depends on what it is that you're buying. I can't think at the top of my mind what are the biggest ones that we are using. I'm trying to think of a creative example. Oh, so it could be pre-testing, post-testing, and where they sit within that. It can be things like if it's, big productions, where did they land on their production budget? How much has it moved since the PPM in terms of what you actually shot? And then on the media, it's going to be things like reach, I suppose. But I'm probably telling you all things you already know. No rocket science from me, I'm afraid.
Juan, Pablo, do you have got a bit more time to think of examples that you're using?
Yeah. So Claire gave me the responsibility of coming up with the rocket science to show an example. Now, I think I touched on a couple of ones, but Claire has a point as well, right? Depending on the type of campaign and the type of work that the agency is doing, the KPIs are different, right? I'll go back and I'd say the qualitative ones, and we focus on NPS big time, right? Just kind of to assess the relationship. We have a process to measure or to, let's say, grade creativity, right? On a scale within our system, and kind of assess the campaign after it's done and say, where did it land? And was it on let's say, on the terms that we expected? And then when I touched about brand performance, right? I think it goes back to the basic ones. Brand power could be engagement. We've done earn rate, for example. There's usually the ones that we focus on, trying to be a little bit more on the results side of the impact of the campaign.
Thank you. And my last question before we move to remuneration, we had a few questions around in-housing and in-house agencies. I don't know if you guys at AbInBev and Estée Lauder, you have in-house agencies, but do you think the process should be sort of different? Should our performance process evolve, or do you think you should sort of apply similar rules? Because in the end, yes, it's an in-house setup, but it's still sort of agency. So what are your views on this? Juan, Pablo, I see you nodding. Maybe you go first.
Yeah, happy to. And I was nodding at, yes, so we do have an in-house agency, right? That we have been creating for the past couple of years. And there are, let's say, 2 things that I would, or 2 ways that I would frame my answer. The first one is in-house agencies should also be measured, right? It's not because it's in-house, we don't need to measure it, because then if we don't measure it, we tend to risk that the agency will go in a track that might not be what we want, right? So, I mean, with the certain exceptions around certain KPIs that might not be applicable, it should mirror, let's say, the evaluation that we have on our external agencies. But there is one thing on performance that I would suggest right now on external agencies with companies that have an in-house agency, and that's the ability to work together, right? At least on our perspective is we're not creating an in-house agency to replace, for example, certain type of agency. It could be creative agencies and so on. To a certain extent, we're making it so they can work together, right? So that interaction can be super fruitful if done properly. And one of the KPIs that we should think at the future of having is to make sure how our in-house agency and our external partners are interacting with each other. And if the external partners are leveraging the capabilities that we have developed in-house to get a better result.
That's a really good point. And it's very true. Very usually you don't bring everything in-house. You're still going to have external partners. So the collaboration between your new in-house setup with your existing or new external partners is super important. I agree with you.
Yep.
Claire, I saw you unmuted yourself. Do you want to add something?
I don't have the experience of much in-house agency, not in a big machine way anyway. But I think one thing I would probably look at is, as well as the things that I mentioned before, is just I'd probably want more of a deep dive as to how it's running in terms of the metrics and the how many briefs they're taking, how long it's taking, and things like that. Especially if they've been they're dedicated to see how that runs. So we're not just having people sort of plopped in your office and then they get on with it, but there's some sort of, you get the benefit hopefully of a structure that sits around it in terms of how that in-house agency works. I think it depends on whether they're your employees and you're doing it yourself, or whether you've got an agency that's sort of done an implant type of solution. But I would want a bit of a zoom basically on management information and how that's running, and the data analytical side of how that links with all the other agencies are the things that come to mind. But I'm making it up because I haven't done it yet.
Thank you so much. Right, so let's talk about remuneration, or I think in the US you call it compensation. So and someone in the chat said I think the next stage of partnership should tie the performance with the company achievement numbers. That requires the agencies to agree putting a portion of the fees into risk, which are negotiated to take place next year. So what are your views on performance-based remuneration, also called PBR, compensation models? Do you think this is the way to go moving forward, and beyond hourly rates payments, for instance? What are your views? Okay, sorry, just go for it.
Yeah. So I've done it a number of ways, and I seem to find that in the past, I'm talking more about the past than necessarily now, it kind of evolved a bit. So I've done it where we agreed fees and then sort of withheld some of those fees, and then they had to work to get their money back basically. I think that probably works for about 1 year, because it's exhausting and they feel quite threatened. And if it doesn't quite work out the first year, which it probably won't, because it's the first year and you're going through the learning curve, so it's pretty tough to actually achieve a lot in the first year. You're not going to explode it. So if you're withholding it and they don't get it all back, then it's quite painful. And then sort of evolved into bonus malus, so they could lose, but they could win a bit extra, and I think those ones work quite well. And again, I relate it back a bit to sort of internal teams. If you have a bonus, then it kind of motivates you a little bit. It just needs to be structured in the way that means that the way it's measured, talking back to your KPIs and your performance reviews, relates well to how they're going to get their bonus. I think it's hard to relate it sometimes to people try and relate it to net sales and things like that. It's hard because they are not the only factor in as to whether you're going to achieve certain net sales. So the metric needs to be quite related to them exactly, because if there's other influences that means that they're not going to get it, then it can become a little bit unfair. I don't know if I need to elaborate more. Rules of the game being quite clear at the beginning. Ideally, bonus malus, I would avoid just withholding profit To be honest, I'm not sure that sets the right scene in terms of the relationship. I wouldn't like my salary withheld. But if they have a big enough profit margin, then it might not be a problem. But yeah, let's see.
Yeah, and I agree with you. At least covering the agency costs. You shouldn't be, even if you didn't perform very well, you shouldn't be working on the account anyway. But
yeah,
on top as a bonus or
yeah. And even if you withhold some of the profit, you wouldn't withhold all of the profit. So they still need to be making money. If they're not, then they're not going to be able to invest in growing themselves. And if ideally you want them to grow as much as, yes, you're pushing them so that you grow as a client, but they kind of need to grow as well. Otherwise they're going to become a bit stagnant and then it's not going to be delivering what you want. So
one point that you raised as well that I quite like is thinking of the time frame to reach the objectives, which I think is a good one. Like if you give an objective but you're that is reachable in 2 or 3 years, but you evaluate after 1 year, this is not really fair as well. So you need to give enough time.
No, and it might be that your KPIs are going to change year on year, and maybe your percentages will change, and often you push them a bit more as you go because you want incremental benefits and things. But just be careful the first year, because it is the year of the learning curve, and a lot of that is to do with the client as much as the agency. But yes, they need to prove themselves, but they probably overinvest in that period anyway. So
thank you, Juan. Pablo, we have 4 minutes left, so no pressure. But we have a few more questions. But what are your views on PBR models, and do you think this is the way to go?
I'll make it short and quick. So I think both of you touched on the key points on this, right? I do think that performance-based compensation is the present and should keep evolving to be the future. For me, there's nothing more meaningless than sitting with an agency and discussing hourly rates and overheads and margins and just having a fixed staffing plan. Is just, what's the purpose, right? I like to focus more on understanding what is the complexity of the ask that we're giving the agency, right? The deliverables and the time frame that they're gonna need, the time frame they're gonna need to deliver, and what are those deliverables, and focus on that, right? And based on the impact, awarding them a certain amount of investment, right? Now, to your point, there's no agency that is gonna work for free or put up risk 50% of their payroll just to see if they get a good enough result. That's just not gonna happen, right? So, and I think I touched on earlier at this point, what we're trying to do is make sure as well that we give them enough of a fixed compensation that will cover their cost plus a margin, right? We believe in variable compensation being something that expands their margin, therefore making this relationship more appealing, and that variable compensation should be attributable to the brand, to the agency, putting a cherry on top to try to motivate him, but as well, and like I said, giving them an insight on what are the different things that are in our head and on our pipeline that are things that we're not going to invest on, for them to have that opportunity. So if you think about, and somebody on the audience says share the reward, maybe when you think about the big metrics of the company, there is a thinking that says the agency should share the pain and should share the reward. And I think that's true. It's just the tricky part is how we make them share the pain, let's call it that. Because sharing the reward, it can be very easily manageable. And that's why we said, okay, share the pain is we're telling you that there is X amount of money more for us to invest around these ideas that we're still not sure, right? And for us, the pain would be that they are not proactive enough to try to grab that money. Therefore, they will not keep expanding the business with us. They will on the side, on the part that we're asking and telling them specifically what we need, but there's additional opportunity for them to do that and money there. So the pain would be for them not to have access to that money that is there up for grabs if they come with things on top. But I 100% agree with PBR.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's a trend as well. So you're not the only two ones to use it. We see it within the WFN network, and I'm sure in the audience as well. Quite a lot of people are quite familiar with this model. Right. So last minute, I'll jump to my next question to you. If there is one thing that you'd like the audience to remember, like one top tip towards successful agency management, agency performance evaluations, what would it be? Just in a quick sentence, the one thing you want people to remember?
For me, it's to do a 360. You need to look at yourself as well as the agency.
100%. I would echo that and say, for me, it's clear alignment on expectations and goals and constant communication. If you do that, there's success down the road.
Thank you so much. And I would add also 360 and ensuring that agencies are able to tell the truth about the client's performance as well. That would be my watch out, because sometimes you feel you're giving the opportunity to agencies to feedback on you, but actually they're probably too scared to tell you the truth, and then it's not very workable or actionable feedback. So that would be my to build on you. Thank you so much. Tina, I think you're going to come back and say, I don't know, do you want me to say goodbye, or you're the one saying goodbye?
Great job, everybody. That was a fantastic discussion. I'm really glad I got to be part of it. Everybody, thank you for coming. The next thing would be to head back to your interactive agenda. And for the next session, which would start at 2 o'clock, we have the 2 rooms. Thank you guys very much for spending time with us. I did save the chat, so if you wanted to have it later, because a lot of things came in on the chat, and we recorded it, so we'll get it back out to you. But Claire and Pablo, thank you guys very much for coming, and it was great to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy to be part of this. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.